My name is Clara Reeves, and I was 33 years old when a lawyer called me on a Monday morning while I was eating breakfast and told me that my grandmother had left me everything. Not some things, not a share of things, everything. The house she had lived in for 40 years, the investment accounts she had been quietly building since before my father was born, the contents of the house, including pieces of furniture that had been in her family for 3 generations, and a letter, sealed, addressed to me by name, that she had deposited with the lawyer 2 years before she died, with instructions that it be given to me privately before any other communication with any other member of the family took place. I sat at my kitchen table with a piece of toast in my hand, and I listened to the lawyer, a man named Arthur Finch, who had the careful, measured voice of someone who has delivered life-altering information enough times to have learned the exact tone that conveys seriousness without alarm, and I did not say anything for a long moment. Then I said, "Does my father know?" Arthur Finch said, "Not yet." He said, "Your grandmother's instructions were explicit. You were to be contacted first and given the opportunity to read the letter before any other notification was made." I said, "When can I come in?" He said, "I have time this afternoon if you are available." I said, "I will be there." I put the toast down, and I sat at my table and I thought about my grandmother Eleanor, who had been the quietest and most deliberate person I had ever known, and I thought, she planned this. She planned every single detail of this, and she did it on purpose, and she did it for me. And I started to cry, which I had not done in a long time, and I let myself, because she had earned my tears, and I had been holding them for years. Before I tell you what was in the letter, let me tell you about my family, because the letter only makes sense if you understand the years that preceded it. My father, Richard Reeves, married my mother when he was 26. I was born 2 years later. My mother died when I was 9, a car accident on a winter road, the kind of loss that does not have a clean shape and does not produce a clean grief, but leaves a gap in the architecture of a childhood that everything else has to build around. My father was devastated. I know that. I have never doubted that he loved my mother or that her death broke something in him that took years to partially repair. What I also know, and have had more years than I wanted to spend understanding, is that grief can make people vulnerable in ways that other people sometimes recognize and use. My father met Diane Coulter 4 years after my mother died. I was 13. Diane was 41, recently divorced, with 2 children of her own from her first marriage, a son named Brett, who was 16, and a daughter named Kayla, who was 14. She was polished and attentive, and laughed at my father's jokes and looked at him the way a woman looks at a man when she has decided he is exactly what she needs, and has begun the work of making him believe she is exactly what he needs in return. My father married her 18 months after they met. I was 14 years old, and I stood at the back of the room at their small ceremony and tried to feel something other than the specific dread of a child who understands that the shape of her life is about to change in ways she cannot measure. Diane was not cruel to me in ways that leave marks people can see. That is the important thing to understand about how the next several years worked. She was not someone who screamed or hit or withheld food or said terrible things where witnesses could hear them. What she was, and what I came to understand with the particular clarity that comes from having years to review the evidence, was a careful and patient architect of my father's perception of me. She worked slowly, she worked consistently, and she worked in the register of concern, which is the most effective and the most difficult to counter, because it sounds like love. She would tell my father, after a school event, that she was worried about me, that I seemed withdrawn, that she was not sure I was adjusting well. She would report conversations she claimed to have had with me in which I had said things I had not said, small things, nothing that could be directly disproved, but things that painted me as difficult or ungrateful or resistant to the family she was trying to build.
She would say these things with her hand on my father's arm and her voice in the register of someone who wants only the best for everyone involved. My father believed her. He believed her because he loved her, and because grief had made him dependent on her steadiness in a way he could not fully see, and because I was a teenager, and teenagers are, by cultural agreement, assumed to be the difficult party in any conflict with an adult who presents as reasonable. I learned very early that I could not win a contest of credibility with Diane, so I stopped trying to win it and started doing something else instead, which was building a life she could not touch. My grandmother, Eleanor, had always seen it. That is the thing I want to establish clearly, because it is the foundation of everything that comes after. Eleanor Reeves was my father's mother, a woman in her late 70s when all of this was at its worst, sharp and observant in the way of people who have spent decades watching human behavior and have long since stopped being surprised by it, but have not stopped being interested. She did not interfere. This was a deliberate choice on her part, and I understand it now better than I understood it then. She did not have the standing to interfere in her son's marriage without being positioned as the difficult mother-in-law, which Diane would have used against her immediately and efficiently. She did not have access to the conversations between Diane and my father that were shaping his view of me. What she had was her relationship with me directly, which she protected with the quiet tenacity of someone who understands that some things can only be preserved by never making them part of the larger conflict. She called me every week through high school. She came to my graduation when my father forgot to mark the date and showed up a day late. She drove 4 hours to attend my college performances and my work events, and the small milestones that my father consistently missed because Diane had filled his calendar with other things. She never said anything about Diane directly. She never needed to. What she said, consistently and in different ways across different years, was, "Clara, I see you. I see exactly what you are doing, and I see exactly who you are, and I want you to know that those two things matter to someone." The will situation had a specific beginning, which was a conversation my father had with me when I was 27. I was living in another city by then, working in marketing at a mid-sized company, building my life with the focused independence of someone who has learned to not rely on the people who were supposed to be my foundation. My father called me on a Sunday afternoon and said he wanted to talk about some estate planning he and Diane had been doing. I said, okay. He said, "Diane and I have decided to structure things so that everything goes to her children and to any children we might have together, and that you would receive a smaller share, given that you have established yourself so well independently." I listened to this with the particular quality of attention you give to something that you saw coming from a distance and have been waiting to arrive. I said, "A smaller share, meaning what?" He said, "We thought 15%. I said, "Of what specifically?" He went through the numbers. The house, the investment accounts, the business he had built over 30 years, a regional supply company that had done well enough to be the primary source of his wealth. 15%. Brett and Kayla split the rest equally, with a portion set aside for any future children. I said, "Dad, that is your decision to make, and I am not going to argue about it." He said, "I knew you would understand." I said I was not going to argue about it. I did not say I understood. There is a difference. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Diane felt it was the most equitable arrangement." I thought, of course she did. I said, "I have to go." I hung up and I did not call back for 3 weeks, and when we did not mention it again.
I called my grandmother the same evening my father called me about the will. Not to report what he had said, not to ask her to intervene, but because she was the person I called when something had happened that I needed to say out loud to someone who would understand the full weight of it without requiring me to explain the history. She answered on the second ring. I told her what my father had said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I see." I said, "I am not calling to ask you to do anything." I said, "I just needed to tell someone who would understand why it matters beyond the money." She said, "I know why it matters. It matters because it is the formal version of a story that has been being told about you for years. It is the version that goes into documents." I said, "Yes." She said,
"Clara, I need you to trust me about something." I said, "Okay." She said, "I am not going to tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask you to continue doing what you have been doing, which is building your life honestly and not allowing what is happening in that family to make you into a smaller or more bitter version of yourself." I said, "I am trying." She said, "I know you are." She said, "Keep trying." I said, "Okay." She said, "I love you very much." I said, "I love you too, Grandma." We talked for another hour about other things, her garden and my work, and a book she was reading, and I felt in those hours the particular relief of being known by someone who has chosen to know you clearly and has not flinched at what they found. The years between that phone call and my grandmother's death were 3. She died at 81, peacefully, in her own home, in the bed she had slept in for 40 years. I was with her in the last week. I had taken time off work and driven to her house and stayed, sleeping on the couch in her living room, making her tea and reading to her, and sitting beside her bed in the evenings while she drifted in and out of sleep. My father visited twice in that week. Diane did not come at all. On the second visit, my father sat in the kitchen while I made coffee, and he looked around the house with the particular assessing look of a man who is calculating what something is worth, which I noticed and recorded and did not say anything about. My grandmother died on a Thursday morning. I was holding her hand. My father arrived an hour after she passed. He stood in the doorway of her bedroom and looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "We should call the lawyer today." I said, "I will handle it." He said, "There are things we need to go over." I said, "I know." I said, "I will handle it." He looked at me with the particular expression he had been giving me since I was 14, the expression of a man who has been told I am difficult and is looking for evidence of it in ordinary statements. I looked back at him with the expression of a woman who has spent 19 years building something he does not know the shape of yet. I said, "Go home, Dad. I will call you." He went. I sat beside my grandmother's bed for a long time after everyone had left, and I talked to her, which is something I do not normally do, but which felt correct in that room. And I said, "I hope you knew how much I loved you." I think she did. I think she planned for it. The lawyer called me 4 days after my grandmother's funeral. Arthur Finch, whose name I had seen on documents at my grandmother's house, and who she had mentioned to me once, briefly, as someone she trusted to handle things correctly. He called my personal number, not my father's, which I did not find strange until I was already on the phone with him, and he was telling me that I had been named as sole beneficiary of Eleanor Reeves' estate, and that there was a letter she had left for me that she wanted me to receive before any other family communication took place. I asked him how long she had been planning this. He said, "The will was last updated 2 years ago. The letter was written at the same time. She was very clear about the sequence of events she wanted to happen." I said, "Was she of sound mind when she made these decisions?" He said, "I can tell you that I met with her personally on 4 occasions over the 2 years preceding her death, and that she was one of the clearest and most deliberate clients I have worked with in 25 years of practice." He said, "She knew exactly what she was doing." I said, "I know she did. That was not a legal question." He said, "I understand." I said, "I will be there this afternoon." He said, "I will have everything ready." I drove to his office in a state that was not quite any single emotion, but a combination of several: grief and something that was not quite gratitude, but was adjacent to it, the feeling of being seen from beyond a distance by someone who is no longer there to see you. Arthur Finch's office was exactly what a lawyer's office should look like, organized and serious, with the particular weight of paperwork at signals someone who understands that documents are the things that matter when everything else is disputed. He shook my hand and sat across from me and slid the letter across the desk first, before any other document. He said, "She was specific that you should read this before we discuss anything else." I said, "Thank you." The envelope had my name on it in her handwriting, Clara, not Clara Reeves, just Clara, the way she had always addressed things to me, as if the last name was unnecessary between us, because she knew which Clara she meant, and there was never any question. I opened it carefully. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten, in the precise and slightly formal script she had used her entire life. I am not going to read you every word of it, because some of those words belong only to me, but I am going to tell you what it contained, because it is the heart of this story, and without it, none of what follows makes full sense. She told me that she had watched what happened to me in my father's house for 19 years. She told me she had not interfered directly because she had understood that interference would have been weaponized and used to further isolate me. She told me she had done the only thing she could do, which was to stay present in my life and to make her plans accordingly. She told me that the estate was mine because I had earned it, not through performance or through strategy, but through the particular kind of character that reveals itself over time when someone is watching carefully and has decided that what they see is worth protecting. The letter contained other things too. It contained her account of specific moments she had witnessed over the years that had shaped her understanding of what was happening in my father's house. A Christmas when I was 16, where Diane had told my father, within my grandmother's earshot, that I had said something cruel to Kayla that I had not said, and my father had believed it, and I had been sent to my room while the family finished dinner. My grandmother had been sitting in the next room reading when that conversation happened. She had heard every word. She had written it down that evening in a journal she had been keeping, she told me, since the year my father married Diane. The journal documented incidents across 19 years, conversations she had overheard, patterns she had observed, the systematic and patient work of a woman who had been building a case against me in my own family's eyes for nearly 2 decades. My grandmother had been building a counter case, in private, in ink, in a journal that she had deposited with Arthur Finch, along with the will and the letter. She told me in the letter that the journal was mine to use as I saw fit. She said, "I do not know what you will choose to do with it. I know that whatever you choose will be the right thing, because I have watched you make decisions for 30 years, and you have never once chosen the small version of yourself when the larger one was available." I read that line 3 times. Then I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope and looked at Arthur Finch and said, "What do we do next?"
Arthur Finch walked me through the estate. The house, fully paid off, valued at just over $400,000 in the current market, the investment accounts, which my grandmother had been building methodically since the 1970s and which had grown over 5 decades of consistent and unglamorous investing into a portfolio worth approximately $1.2 million. The contents of the house, including furniture, jewelry, and personal items, some of which had significant monetary value and all of which had the specific, irreplaceable value of things that belonged to someone you loved, and the journal. 31 years of documented observations written in the precise, formal hand of a woman who understood that memory is unreliable and ink is not. I sat with all of this information and felt the particular weight of it, not the financial weight, though that was real and significant, but the weight of understanding what my grandmother had done and why, and how long she had been doing it without telling me, because telling me would have changed how I carried myself, and she needed me to carry myself the way I actually had, without the knowledge of what she was building on my behalf, so that what I built was genuinely mine and not a performance shaped by knowing I had a safety net. She had protected me by not telling me she was protecting me. That is the kind of love that takes a long time to fully understand. Arthur Finch asked me when I wanted him to notify my father. I said, "Give me a week." He said, "The will is a matter of record, and your father is likely to inquire about the estate given your mother's passing." I said, "I understand." I said, "Give me a week to read the journal and decide how I want to approach this before the notification happens." He said, "I can give you 5 days.
That is within the timeline the will specifies for notification of interested parties. I said, 5 days. I drove home with the journal in a bag on my passenger seat. It was a hard-covered notebook, the kind with a cloth cover, dark green, the kind my grandmother had always kept on her desk. I had seen it there for years without knowing what it contained. I had assumed it was the kind of notebook an older woman keeps for appointments and telephone numbers and the addresses of people she does not want to forget. I had been right that it was the kind of thing she kept to remember. I had been wrong about what she was remembering. I sat at my kitchen table that evening, the same kitchen table where I had eaten breakfast when Arthur Finch called, and I opened the journal to the first entry. It was dated in October, the year my father married Diane. My grandmother's handwriting, precise and careful, recording what she had observed at the wedding reception, the way Diane had positioned herself between my grandmother and my father during every photograph, the way she had redirected my grandmother's attempt to speak to me alone, the way she had, at the end of the evening, quietly suggested to my father that his mother seemed to be having a hard time with the change. I read the first entry, and I understood that my grandmother had understood everything from the very beginning. I read the journal over 3 evenings. I want to be honest about what that experience was like, because the honest version is more complicated than the satisfying version. The satisfying version is that I read it and felt vindicated and resolved and ready to act. The honest version is that I read it and felt all of those things and also felt grief. The specific grief of seeing the years of your childhood laid out in someone else's clear handwriting and understanding the full shape of what happened to you in a way that you could not see clearly when you were living inside it. My grandmother had documented 31 years, not every day, not even every month, but the significant moments, the ones that shifted something, the ones that revealed the pattern more clearly. I read about things I remembered from my own perspective and saw them from hers, which was often different in the details and always the same in the conclusion. I read about things I had not known were happening, conversations my father had with Diane that my grandmother had overheard, decisions that had been made about me in rooms I was not in, the slow and methodical work of a woman who was not cruel in any single dramatic moment, but who was, across 3 decades, consistently and deliberately making me smaller in my father's eyes. I also read about my grandmother's love for me, which was woven through every entry, not as sentiment but as action, the specific things she had done and said across 31 years to make sure I knew I was seen. I had known she loved me. I had not known the full extent to which she had spent 31 years making sure that love had consequences.
On the 5th day, I called my father, not to tell him about the will, to hear his voice, and to give myself the chance to decide based on that conversation how I wanted to handle the next part. He answered on the 3rd ring. He said, "Clara, I have been trying to reach you." I said, "I know. I have been dealing with some things related to Grandma's estate." He said, "Yes, I wanted to talk to you about that." I said, "Okay." He said, "Diane and I have been thinking about the house. We thought perhaps Brett might want to use it as a rental property. It is in a good location and the market is strong." I said, "I see." He said, "Obviously, we would want to get the estate sorted out first, but we thought it would be good to start thinking about the practical questions." I listened to this with the particular quality of attention you give to something that tells you everything you need to know about the current state of a person's assumptions. My father was operating on the assumption that my grandmother's estate would pass according to standard expectations, which, given that my father was her son and her closest next of kin, he assumed meant to him. He had not considered that she might have planned otherwise. Diane had certainly not considered it. I said, "Dad, Arthur Finch will be in touch with you this week." He said, "Good, yes, I was going to call his office." I said, "Let him call you first." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because that is the correct order of things."
He said, "Clara, is everything all right?" I said, "Everything is fine, Dad." I said, "Let Arthur call you. I will talk to you after." I hung up, and I sat at my table, and I thought about what the next few days were going to look like, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, entirely calm. Arthur Finch called my father on a Thursday. I know this because Arthur called me first, as a courtesy, to let me know the notification was happening that day. He said, "I want you to be prepared for the possibility that your father will contact you immediately after this call." I said, "I am prepared." He said, "The notification will be straightforward. He will be informed that the estate passes entirely to you as sole beneficiary, and that the will was properly executed and witnessed and is not subject to challenge on any procedural grounds." I said, "And the journal?" He said, "The journal is personal property that your grandmother bequeathed to you as part of her personal effects. It is not part of the formal legal record unless you choose to make it so." I said, "I understand." He said, "Is there anything you need from me before I make this call?" I said, "No." I said, "Thank you, Arthur." He said, "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman." I said, "I know." He said, "So are you, for what it is worth." I said, "It is worth something." I hung up, and I made tea, and I sat at my window, and I waited. My father called 47 minutes later. I let it ring to voicemail. He called again immediately. I let it ring again. The third call I answered. He said, "Clara." His voice had the quality of a person who has just had the floor removed from under them and has not yet decided whether to be angry or confused, and is currently both. He said, "I just spoke with Arthur Finch." I said, "I know." He said, "He says everything goes to you." I said, "Yes." He said, "Clara, what is going on?" I told my father I would come and see him, not that evening, which is when he wanted, but the following Saturday, which gave me 5 days to decide exactly what I was going to say and how I was going to say it. He did not like the 5-day wait. He said, "Diane and I need to understand what has happened." I said, "I know you do." I said, "Saturday." He said, "This is not fair to us, Clara." I said, "Dad, I'm going to come and see you on Saturday, and we are going to have a conversation, and I'm going to answer your questions. That is what I can offer right now." He said, "Fine." He said it the way people say fine when they mean the opposite. I spent those 5 days doing 2 things. I reread the journal, specifically the entries I thought were most relevant to the conversation I was about to have, and I spent time deciding what I wanted from that conversation, which is a step people often skip because they are focused on what they are going to say rather than what they actually need as an outcome. I did not want a fight. I did not want to punish my father, though I was aware that what was coming was going to feel like punishment to him and to Diane, regardless of how I framed it. What I wanted was for my father to understand what had happened, not my grandmother's decision, but the years of it, the long story that had produced the decision. I wanted him to see it clearly, possibly for the first time. I understood that whether he was capable of seeing it clearly was not something I could control. I could only control what I offered him and how honestly I offered it. I drove to my father's house on Saturday morning, the house I had grown up in, that was my mother's house before it was Diane's, that had been redecorated within a year of my father's remarriage in ways that removed every visible trace of my mother from the common spaces. Diane had done this carefully and incrementally, framing it each time as freshening things up, modernizing, giving the house new energy, and my father had allowed it because he was grieving, and because allowing it was easier than having the conversation about what it actually meant. I had not lived there since I left for college at 18, and I had visited only on the occasions that felt mandatory, Christmas and my father's birthday, fewer and fewer as the years passed. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, and then I went to the door. Diane answered. This surprised me because I had not expected her to answer, had half expected my father to have asked her to give us space for this conversation, which told me something about how much space he had given her in his management of what was about to happen. She looked at me with the particular expression she had been giving me for 19 years, the one that performed warmth, while its eyes assessed. She said, "Clara, come in." My father was in the living room. He stood when I came in, which he does when he's nervous, a physical habit I have known since childhood. Diane sat beside him on the couch. I sat in the chair across from them, and I put my bag on the floor, and I looked at them both, and I said, "I want to tell you about my grandmother."
I did not lead with the journal. I want to be clear about that, because the sequence matters. I started with what I knew from my own experience, the 19 years of my own life that I had lived in the shadow of Diane's careful management of my father's perception. I told him about the Christmas, when I was 16, the one my grandmother had documented, where I had been accused of saying something to Kayla that I had not said. I told him what had actually happened from my perspective, which was that Kayla had said something cruel to me first, and I had walked away without responding, and that what Diane had reported to him was not what had occurred. My father looked at me. He said, "Diane told me what happened." I said, "Diane told you her version of what happened." He said, "Why would she lie about that?" And there it was, the question I had been waiting for, the question that revealed exactly where we were still starting from, which was the assumption that Diane's account was the baseline and my account was the variation that required justification. I said, "Dad, that is exactly the question I need you to sit with. Not why would she lie in that specific instance, the broader question. Why, across 19 years, whenever there was a conflict between my account of something and Diane's, did you consistently assume hers was correct?" He looked at the table. Diane said, "I think that is unfair." I said, "Diane, I am going to ask you to let me finish talking to my father." She looked at me with the expression of a woman who is not accustomed to being addressed that way and has not yet decided how to respond to it. I talked for a long time. I want to be honest about the fact that I had prepared for this conversation carefully, and that what I said was not improvised, but was the result of years of thought and 5 days of specific preparation. I went through incidents across the years, not all of them, not even most of them, but the ones I had corroborated with my grandmother's journal, and that I therefore knew were not subject to the accusation that I was misremembering. I described what had happened. I described what had been reported to my father. I described the gap between those two things. My father listened. Diane interrupted twice, and I redirected twice, and after the second redirection, she sat back and became very still in the way of someone who was calculating rather than feeling. My father's face changed over the course of that conversation, in ways I watched carefully. The first change was defensive, the expression of a man who is hearing something that requires him to have been wrong, and who is resisting that requirement. The second change was something more complicated, a kind of slow cracking, not dramatic, not a collapse, but the particular expression of a person who is beginning to have a doubt they did not have before, and who is not sure what to do with it. I had not brought the journal yet. I was watching to see whether the journal was necessary. I was watching to see whether my father was capable of arriving at doubt on his own, with only my account to work from, before I introduced evidence that he could not dismiss. My father said, "Clara, even if some of what you are saying is accurate, I do not understand what this has to do with your grandmother's will." He said it carefully, in the tone of a man who is trying to find the part of the conversation he can manage. I said, "It has everything to do with it." I said, "Grandma Eleanor watched this family for 31 years. She watched what happened to me in this house. She watched the decisions that were made about me, including the decision about the will that you told me about 4 years ago. She made her own decisions accordingly." He said, "She had no way of knowing the full picture." I said, "She had more of the full picture than you did, Dad." He said, "That is not possible. She was not here for most of it." I said, "She was here for more of it than you knew." And then I reached into my bag and I put the journal on the table between us. He looked at it. He said, "What is that?" I said, "It's a journal your mother kept for 31 years. It's an account of what she observed in this family from the year you married Diane until the year she died.
It is documented, dated, specific, and written in her handwriting, which I am confident you will recognize. I said, I am not asking you to read it today. I am asking you to understand that it exists and that she wrote it deliberately and that she wanted me to have it. My father looked at the journal on the table for a long time. Then he said, Can I hold it? I said, Yes.
He held the journal without opening it. He turned it over in his hands and looked at the cover, and I watched him recognize it. The cloth cover, the dark green, the specific kind of notebook that had always been on his mother's desk. He said, She always had one of these. I said, Yes. He said, I thought she used them for addresses and appointments. I said, She used them for that too. He set it down on the table and looked at his hands and said nothing for a long moment. Diane said, Richard, I think we should speak with our own attorney before this goes any further. My father looked at her. It was a brief look, a few seconds, but something in it was different from the look I was accustomed to seeing him give her, which was the look of a man who is orienting himself by her position the way a compass orients by north. This look had a question in it, a small one, not a challenge, not a rupture, just a question, the visible presence of a doubt that had not been there before. He said, Clara, I would like to read the journal. Not today, but I would like to read it. I said, I know. I said, that is your decision to make, and I will support it. He said, Will you leave it with me? I said, No. I said, It is mine, and I am not leaving it here, but I will make copies of the relevant sections and send them to you, and when you have read them, I think we should talk again. He nodded. Diane said nothing. I picked up the journal and put it back in my bag, and I stood up and I said, I am sorry about your mother, Dad. I know you loved her. He said, I know she loved you. I said, I know too. I went to the door and I left, and I drove home, and I sat at my kitchen table, and I felt the particular exhaustion of having done something hard and done it right. I made copies of 37 entries from the journal, the ones that were most specific and most directly relevant to the pattern of what had happened. I had them notarized, which Arthur Finch had suggested as a precaution, and I sent them to my father by certified mail, with a cover letter that was 3 paragraphs long, and said in plain language that I was sharing these entries not as an attack, but as an explanation, that my grandmother had wanted him to understand what she had seen, and that I hoped he would read them with the same openness he had shown when he held the journal in his hands. I sent them on a Monday. He called me on Thursday. His voice was different than it had been on Saturday, the quality of a man who has been sitting with something for 3 days and has not slept well. He said, Clara, I have read them. I said, okay. He said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. I said, I always do. He said, Is there more? I said, There is more in the journal. What I sent you is about 1/3 of it. He was quiet. Then he said, She wrote in it for 31 years. I said, Yes, Dad. He said, I did not know she was watching. I said, That was the point. He said, Clara, I need some time. I said, Take whatever time you need. I am not going anywhere. He said, I am sorry. It was the first time he had said that to me, not about a specific incident, not qualified by a but, just, I am sorry, 3 words in his tired voice on a Thursday afternoon. I said, I know, Dad. I said, I know. The weeks that followed were among the most complicated of my adult life, because complicated situations do not resolve cleanly once a piece of important truth has been introduced. My father was processing something significant, and processing it, from what I could tell from our phone calls, in the presence of Diane, which meant the processing was being managed and shaped in real time by the person most invested in a particular outcome. I could not control that. I had done what I could do, which was give him the journal entries and let them land. What happened in the space between them was not mine to manage.
What I could manage was myself and the decisions I needed to make about the estate, which were real and practical and could not wait for my father's emotional timeline. I called Arthur Finch and told him I was ready to begin the formal process of estate administration. He said, "There is one matter I should mention." He said, "Your father's attorney has been in contact regarding a possible challenge to the will." I said, "On what grounds?" He said, "They are claiming that your grandmother was unduly influenced in her estate planning decisions and that the will does not reflect her actual intentions." I said, "Arthur, you met with her 4 times over 2 years." He said, "I did." He said, "I am not concerned about a challenge." I said, "Good." He said, "I want you to be aware that it may cause some delay and some additional legal cost." I said, "What is the likely outcome?" He said, "In my professional opinion, given the documentation supporting the will and the nature of the evidence your grandmother left, any challenge would be unsuccessful." I said, "Proceed." He said, "Understood." The challenge was filed by an attorney named Gregory Hall on behalf of my father and Diane. Arthur Finch reviewed it and called me the same day to tell me it was exactly what he had expected and exactly as weak as he had anticipated. The grounds were undue influence, the claim that I had somehow manipulated my grandmother into changing her will in my favor. The challenge did not specify what form this manipulation had taken, or when it had occurred, or how a granddaughter living in another city exercised undue influence on a woman Arthur Finch had personally assessed as sharp and deliberate on 4 separate occasions. I read the challenge when Arthur sent it to me, and I felt the particular feeling you feel when someone does something that reveals exactly who they are in a way that removes all remaining ambiguity. This was Diane's strategy. It had her fingerprints all over it, in the specific way her strategies always did, positioning me as the bad actor, herself as the victim of circumstances, and my father as a man defending his mother's actual wishes against the manipulation of his difficult daughter. I said to Arthur, "What do we do?" He said, "We respond with the documentation we have, the will, the meeting records, the affidavits from the witnesses to the will signing, and if necessary, the journal entries that speak to your grandmother's clarity and intention." I said, "Use whatever you need." He said, "I do not expect this to reach a courtroom. People who file weak challenges generally do not want to reach a courtroom because courtrooms require evidence, and the evidence here favors you completely." I said, "How long will it take to resolve?" He said, "Likely 3 to 4 months." I said, "Fine." I said, "I have been patient for 33 years. A few more months is manageable."
My father called me during the challenge period, not about the legal matter, or not only about it, but to talk, which was something we had not done in years in any real sense. He said, "Diane thinks we should see this through the courts." I said, "That is her decision to make, and yours." He said, "What do you think I should do?" I said, "Dad, I am not going to tell you what to do in your own marriage." He said, "I am not asking about my marriage. I am asking what you think." I said, "I think your mother made her wishes clear and that those wishes deserve to be honored." I said, "I think the challenge will not succeed and that pursuing it will cost money and time and will not change the outcome." I said, "I think the reason it was filed is more about what Diane wants to believe about the situation than about what is actually true about the situation." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Diane is very upset about this." I said, "I know." He said, "She feels that my mother's decision was a judgment against her." I said, "It was." I said, "That is not the same as it being unfair or incorrect. It was a judgment by a woman who watched for 31 years and made a careful, considered, documented decision." He said, "Clara, I have been reading more of the entries." I said, "I know."
He had asked me to send additional sections, and I had sent them 2 weeks before. He said, "There are things in there that I did not know." I said, "I know that too." He said, "I should have known them." I said, "Yes." I said, "But you did not, and that is where we are, and the question now is what you do with what you know." The challenge was withdrawn in month 3. Gregory Hall filed the withdrawal on a Tuesday afternoon, and Arthur Finch called me within the hour. He said, "They have withdrawn the challenge. The estate is clear." I said, "What happened?" He said, "I cannot speak to the specifics of the opposing counsel's decision, but in my experience, challenges are withdrawn when the party filing them becomes convinced that proceeding will produce an outcome worse than the one they are trying to avoid." I said, "Meaning they looked at the evidence and realized they could not win?" He said, "That is a reasonable inference." I said, "Thank you, Arthur." He said, "Your grandmother would be pleased." I said, "I think she expected exactly this." He said, "I think you are right." I hung up and I sat for a moment, and then I called Simone, who had been updated throughout this process and had been the person I called every time I needed to say something out loud before I could think about it clearly. She answered immediately. I said, "It is over." She said, "The challenge?" I said, "Yes." She said, "What do you feel?" I said, "I feel like I have been holding something very heavy for a very long time, and someone has just told me I can set it down." She said, "So set it down." I said, "I'm working on it." She said, "Do you want to come over?" I said, "Yes." I said, "I really do." She said, "I will make dinner." I said, "Thank you." I drove to her house and we ate, and we talked, and we did not talk about the estate for the most of the evening, and it was exactly what I needed, which is a meal with a friend who knows you well enough to know when the most caring thing is to talk about something else entirely. I went to my grandmother's house for the first time as its legal owner on a Saturday in early spring. I had been there many times over the years as her granddaughter and guest, but this was different. The particular difference of being in a space that is now yours to be responsible for and to decide the future of. I walked through every room, the kitchen where she had made tea for every significant conversation of my adult life, the living room with the particular arrangement of furniture she had not changed in 20 years because she liked it and saw no reason to change what worked, her bedroom with the dresser that had had the same items in the same places since I was a child, the small study where her desk was and where the notebook had always sat and where she had spent 31 years recording what she observed. I stood in the study for a long time. I thought about her sitting at this desk in the evenings after phone calls with me, writing down what she had seen and what she thought it meant and what she intended to do about it. I thought about the specific courage that required, the patience of a woman who understood that the most powerful thing she could do was not intervene, but document, not confront, but plan, not rescue me in the moment, but make certain that the long arc of things bent in my direction. I said, "Thank you," out loud in the empty room. It felt inadequate, and it was all I had, and it was something. My father came to the house 3 weeks after the challenge was withdrawn. He called and asked if he could come, and I said yes. He arrived on a Sunday afternoon, and he stood in the doorway of the house he had grown up in and looked around with the expression of a man who is experiencing several things at once and has not yet sorted them into an order he can manage. I made tea in my grandmother's kitchen. We sat at her table. He said, "I keep thinking about the Christmas when you were 16. I said, "I remember it." He said, "I believed Diane." I said, "I know you did." He said, "I should not have." I said, "No." He said, "Clara, I have spent the last several months reading my mother's journal and talking to you, and I have been trying to understand how I allowed this to happen for so long. I said, Dad, you were in love, and you were grieving, and she was very good at what she did. He said, that is not enough of an explanation. I said, no, it is not, but it is the true one. He said, what can I do? I said, there is not a clear answer to that. What happened to me happened over decades, and there isn't an action that undoes decades. What there is what you do going forward and how honestly you do it. He said, I want to try. I said, I know. I said, trying looks like specific things, not apologies. Those matter, but they are not the whole thing. It looks like believing me when I tell you something. It looks like not running decisions about my life through Diane before you talk to me. It looks like showing up. He said, I have not been good at showing up. I said, no, but I'm still here, and that is something we can both start from. Diane and I did not have a direct conversation for months after the challenge was withdrawn. My father told me she was struggling with what the journal had revealed and what the failed challenge had cost them. I received this information and did not offer a response to it because what I felt about Diane's struggle was not something I needed to perform sympathy for, and I had spent enough of my life performing things for Diane's benefit. What I focused on in those months was the practical work of the estate, working with Arthur Finch to complete the administration, making decisions about the house and the accounts, and beginning the slower work of understanding what I wanted my life to look like now that some of the things that had been uncertain for years were resolved. I kept my job. I kept my apartment. I did not make large decisions quickly, because large decisions made quickly in the aftermath of significant change tend to reflect the emotional state of the moment rather than the actual shape of what you want, and I had learned enough about myself to know that I needed time and space before any decision that could not be undone. What I did do was spend more time at my grandmother's house, going through it slowly, deciding what to keep and what to give away, and what to do with the space itself. Being in that house was its own form of processing. It was full of her, and it was full of the history of our relationship, and being in it was both harder and better than I had anticipated.
My father called me during the challenge period, not about the legal matter, or not only about it, but to talk, which was something we had not done in years in any real sense. He said, Diane thinks we should see this through the courts. I said, that is her decision to make and yours. He said, what do you think I should do? I said, Dad, I am not going to tell you what to do in your own marriage. He said, I am not asking about my marriage. I am asking what you think. I said, I think your mother made her wishes clear and that those wishes deserve to be honored. I said, I think the challenge will not succeed and that pursuing it will cost money and time and will not change the outcome. I said, I think the reason it was filed is more about what Diane wants to believe about the situation than about what is actually true about the situation. He was quiet for a moment. He said, Diane is very upset about this. I said, I know. He said, she feels that my mother's decision was a judgment against her. I said, it was. I said, that is not the same as it being unfair or incorrect. It was a judgment by a woman who watched for 31 years and made a careful, considered, documented decision. He said, Clara, I have been reading more of the entries. I said, I know. He had asked me to send additional sections, and I had sent them 2 weeks before. He said, there are things in there that I did not know. I said, I know that too. He said, I should have known them. I said, yes.
I said, "But you did not, and that is where we are, and the question now is what you do with what you know." The challenge was withdrawn in month 3. Gregory Hall filed the withdrawal on a Tuesday afternoon, and Arthur Finch called me within the hour. He said, "They have withdrawn the challenge. The estate is clear." I said, "What happened?" He said, "I cannot speak to the specifics of the opposing counsel's decision, but in my experience, challenges are withdrawn when the party filing them becomes convinced that proceeding will produce an outcome worse than the one they are trying to avoid." I said, "Meaning they looked at the evidence and realized they could not win?" He said, "That is a reasonable inference." I said, "Thank you, Arthur." He said, "Your grandmother would be pleased." I said, "I think she expected exactly this." He said, "I think you are right." I hung up and I sat for a moment, and then I called Simone, who had been updated throughout this process and had been the person I called every time I needed to say something out loud before I could think about it clearly. She answered immediately. I said, "It is over." She said, "The challenge?" I said, "Yes." She said, "What do you feel?" I said, "I feel like I have been holding something very heavy for a very long time, and someone has just told me I can set it down." She said, "So set it down." I said, "I'm working on it." She said, "Do you want to come over?" I said, "Yes." I said, "I really do." She said, "I will make dinner." I said, "Thank you." I drove to her house and we ate, and we talked, and we did not talk about the estate for the most of the evening, and it was exactly what I needed, which is a meal with a friend who knows you well enough to know when the most caring thing is to talk about something else entirely. I went to my grandmother's house for the first time as its legal owner on a Saturday in early spring. I had been there many times over the years as her granddaughter and guest, but this was different. The particular difference of being in a space that is now yours to be responsible for and to decide the future of. I walked through every room, the kitchen where she had made tea for every significant conversation of my adult life, the living room with the particular arrangement of furniture she had not changed in 20 years because she liked it and saw no reason to change what worked, her bedroom with the dresser that had had the same items in the same places since I was a child, the small study where her desk was and where the notebook had always sat and where she had spent 31 years recording what she observed. I stood in the study for a long time. I thought about her sitting at this desk in the evenings after phone calls with me, writing down what she had seen and what she thought it meant and what she intended to do about it. I thought about the specific courage that required, the patience of a woman who understood that the most powerful thing she could do was not intervene, but document, not confront, but plan, not rescue me in the moment, but make certain that the long arc of things bent in my direction. I said, "Thank you," out loud in the empty room. It felt inadequate, and it was all I had, and it was something. My father came to the house 3 weeks after the challenge was withdrawn. He called and asked if he could come, and I said yes. He arrived on a Sunday afternoon, and he stood in the doorway of the house he had grown up in and looked around with the expression of a man who is experiencing several things at once and has not yet sorted them into an order he can manage. I made tea in my grandmother's kitchen. We sat at her table. He said, "I keep thinking about the Christmas when you were 16. I said, "I remember it." He said, "I believed Diane." I said, "I know you did." He said, "I should not have." I said, "No." He said, "Clara, I have spent the last several months reading my mother's journal and talking to you, and I have been trying to understand how I allowed this to happen for so long." I said, "Dad, you were in love, and you were grieving, and she was very good at what she did." He said, "That is not enough of an explanation." I said, "No, it is not. but it is the true one. He said, "What can I do?" I said, "There is not a clear answer to that. What happened to me happened over decades, and there isn't an action that undoes decades. What there is what you do going forward and how honestly you do it." He said, "I want to try." I said, "I know." I said, "Trying looks like specific things, not apologies. Those matter, but they are not the whole thing. It looks like believing me when I tell you something. It looks like not running decisions about my life through Diane before you talk to me. It looks like showing up." He said, "I have not been good at showing up." I said, "No, but I'm still here, and that is something we can both start from." Diane and I did not have a direct conversation for months after the challenge was withdrawn. My father told me she was struggling with what the journal had revealed and what the failed challenge had cost them. I received this information and did not offer a response to it because what I felt about Diane's struggle was not something I needed to perform sympathy for, and I had spent enough of my life performing things for Diane's benefit. What I focused on in those months was the practical work of the estate, working with Arthur Finch to complete the administration, making decisions about the house and the accounts, and beginning the slower work of understanding what I wanted my life to look like now that some of the things that had been uncertain for years were resolved. I kept my job. I kept my apartment. I did not make large decisions quickly, because large decisions made quickly in the aftermath of significant change tend to reflect the emotional state of the moment rather than the actual shape of what you want, and I had learned enough about myself to know that I needed time and space before any decision that could not be undone. What I did do was spend more time at my grandmother's house, going through it slowly, deciding what to keep and what to give away, and what to do with the space itself. Being in that house was its own form of processing. It was full of her, and it was full of the history of our relationship, and being in it was both harder and better than I had anticipated.
My father came back to the house twice more in those months. Both times we talked for several hours. The conversations were different from any we had had before, in that they were honest in a way our conversations had rarely been, not because my father was dishonest by nature, but because for 19 years there had been a third presence in our relationship, Diane's management of it, which had meant that what my father said to me and what he felt and what he actually thought were not always the same thing. Without that management, or with it disrupted, he was different, more uncertain, more present. He said things I had not heard him say before, about my mother, about his grief, about the years when I was a teenager and he was lost inside a relationship that felt like rescue and did not examine what it might be costing. He did not excuse what had happened, he was careful about that. He said, "I am not telling you this to explain it away. I am telling you because you deserve to know that I was not indifferent. I was lost." I said, "I know the difference between indifferent and lost." I said, "I think I always did." He said, "Your grandmother told you that." I said, "She showed me that, by being the one who stayed present when you were lost." He said, "She was a remarkable woman." I said, "Yes." I said, "She was." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am glad she had you." I said, "I am glad I had her." It is the truest thing either of us said in any of those conversations. 6 months after the challenge was withdrawn, Diane asked to meet with me. She called my father's phone and asked him to ask me, which I noted as a strategy, using my father as an intermediary rather than calling me directly, which would have required a kind of vulnerability she was not ready for. I said yes. I want to be honest about why, because it would be easy to say I said yes because I am a forgiving person, or because I believe in closure, or because I wanted to hear what she had to say.
The real reason is more practical. Diane is my father's wife, and my father is in the slow process of rebuilding a relationship with me, and that process will be complicated indefinitely if his wife and I are in permanent open hostility. I said yes because I thought it might be useful, and because I was curious, and because I am someone who prefers to know what I am dealing with directly, rather than it's second-hand. We met at a coffee shop, neutral ground, which was her request and also my preference. She looked different than she had looked at my father's house on the day I brought the journal, more tired, more contained. The performed warmth was gone, which was interesting, whether because she had decided it would not work on me anymore, or because she no longer had the energy to sustain it, I could not tell. She said, "I want to say something to you, and I want you to let me finish before you respond." I said, "Okay." She said, "I know what I did. I know the full version of it, and I have known for a while, longer than I admitted to your father. I would like to tell you what I am prepared to do about it." What Diane said she was prepared to do was specific, and I will give her credit for that, because vague apologies are the currency of people who want the feeling of having addressed something without the cost of actually addressing it, and what she offered was not vague. She said she was prepared to tell my father directly, in my presence if I wanted, a more complete account of the incidents the journal had documented, from her own perspective, which would confirm rather than dispute my grandmother's record. She said she was prepared to acknowledge to Brett and Kayla that the picture they had been given of me over the years was shaped by her and was not accurate. She said she was prepared to stop managing my father's relationship with me, which was the most significant thing she said, and also the most important, because management was the whole structure of the problem, and stopping it was the only thing that could genuinely change the underlying dynamic. I listened to all of this. I said, "Why?" She said, "Because your grandmother's journal ends with an entry written 2 months before she died, and in that entry she writes about what she hopes will happen, and what she fears will happen, and what she trusts will happen because of what she has put in place." She said, "Your father showed me that entry. He read it to me last month." She said, "She hoped you and Richard would find their way back to each other. She feared I would prevent it. She trusted that what she had documented would make prevention difficult." She said, "I would rather be the person who makes it possible than the person your grandmother was afraid I would be." I sat with that for a long time. Then I said, "That is the most honest thing you have ever said to me." She said, "I know."